Hello and welcome once again to another episode of Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. Today I'm going to talk about palynology and forensics. Palynology. What is palynology? It is actually the study of pollen and spores. It's something botanists do quite often just to help to identify plants on an ongoing basis, but it's morphed into something new. Beyond simply the study of plants, it has become something that's been quite useful in forensics, or that is in criminology. Pollen is quite varied. The size, the colors, the shapes, the number of them, the changes in them as a plant progresses through its growth, all these things are rather unique to certain plants and has been used by these botanists for a very long time, but now has been used in criminology. And this has been used for a number of different applications in robbery, in assault, in terrorism, in homicides, many things, and interestingly, in drug deals too, because pollen sticks to drugs, which is rather interesting. It's been something that's been studied since probably the early 50s. It's hard to know when it initially began, but people have been looking at how to collect the samples. It's difficult to collect samples without contaminating them because we got pollen almost everywhere. So you have to be very careful. Samples are put into sterile containers, and people have worked out methods for scraping and rubbing and washing them off of surfaces. Pollen adheres to surfaces because that's one of its mechanisms for dispersal. And it sticks to insects, sticks to animals, and then they'll traipse it around some other place and actually propagate the growth of new plants in new places. So methods have been worked out to clean the pollen, and this is done in a number of ways, but they're treated, for instance, with acids and with sodium hydroxide and with acetic anhydride, with water washes in between to prepare them for usually visualization. A common tool from botanists that's been used by the forensics people as well is scanning electron microscopy or other forms of light microscopy. And it can take a while to study these samples and record what the shapes and sizes and colors and other attributes are. So there are actually in some countries trained palynologists, forensic palynologists. In particular, the UK, Australia, New Zealand are places where people have trained, gotten a PhD, and become certified forensic palynologists. But that's not true everywhere. In fact, the United States, we don't have many. And to my knowledge, it's not even a specialty here. So we're behind in the pollen battle right now. And I hope we catch up because it really is quite useful. I'm going to give you two different examples of how it's been used in solving cases. So the first case I want to tell you about is from 1959 in Austria. And this is a situation where a person was killed in a remote area and no one could find the body. They found a person that they suspected had committed the murder, but he would not confess. And they had very poor evidence at that point. So police looked through his house to see if they could find evidence, and someone found a set of muddy boots. And thought, well, maybe we can have these analyzed, see what we can find. And someone had the bright idea of sending the boots to a Professor Wilhelm Klaus at the University of Vienna, the Department of Paleobotany. And the professor took a look at these boots and he analyzed them for pollen. And he found they contained pollen from alder trees, from willow trees, from spruce. And then he found that had these odd pollen from a hickory tree that in fact was extinct. And the professor knew that. And he also knew there was only one place along the Danube River where those trees once existed. So that guy had to have been there. They confronted him with this information, and just like in the movies, the man confessed and said, okay, I'll take you to where it is, because it was at that spot that the professor had identified. And they found the body and they put him away, all because the professor analyzed the samples for pollen. You can't make that stuff up. This actually happened. The second case I wanted to tell you about occurred in New Zealand in 2005. And this was a case where two men entered a woman's home. They went through the back door that she had left open for her live-in boyfriend, and instead these two men entered. They ended up in her room. She woke. They got frightened. They ran out. One of them dropped his jacket on his way out. And I think he realized that he had done so later, and he returned to the house and re-entered to grab the jacket. When he did, he actually brushed himself against a hypericum plant that was outside. And later that day, one of those two, the guy who had rubbed against the bush, in fact, was arrested as a suspect. And of course, they pleaded not guilty. The police then took his clothes and they wanted to do analysis of them. I think I mentioned at the beginning, New Zealand is one of the places that really does like this palynology technology for forensics. And so they analyzed it and they found hypericum pollen on it. Now, that evidently is not all that unusual. It's kind of common around, but this was all clumped in one area on the clothing. So suggested that the person actually rubbed against a bush that had the pollen. They then looked at the pollen much more closely and realized that its size, its color, its shape, and its state in the development of the pollen was identical to that of the plant right outside the woman's home. So it was nailed. Again, all because of pollen. I find this a particularly interesting area. When I first heard about it, I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if you could actually use different sets of pollen to code things. Code perhaps a painting, perhaps some other precious item. They've actually been able to use rocks that had pollen adhered to them in some of these cases. So, pollen will stick to almost anything. Wouldn't it be interesting if one day you could look it up, and say, oh, I know where that came from. I can authenticate that particular painting because it has the following 5 types of unusual pollen on it. I haven't seen anybody do it yet, but I won't be surprised. So I find this whole area very interesting. It's always surprising to me what people use to generate evidence of crimes and use to code. More recently, in fact, beyond just the shape and size and everything else, people have used DNA sequencing. Sometimes you get lucky and you get enough of the pollen that you can actually isolate enough DNA to sequence it. So then you can actually identify very specifically what the plant is if there's any confusion over the keying identification that a botanist would go through. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you once again for joining me with another interesting story in the history of diagnostics. Diagnostics can even be used in forensics. So I look forward to talking once again about another interesting story in the history of diagnostics. This is Mickey Urdea from Halteris Associates. Thank you very much and bye.